The voices beneath Gyeongsan Cobalt Mine. There are places where people say the darkness feels different. Not simply because the sun cannot reach the ground, or because the walls are covered in decades of dust, but because something terrible happened there, and the place seems to remember it. In South Korea, one of the most disturbing examples is the Gyeongsan Cobalt Mine in Pyeongsan-dong, Gyeongsan, North Gyeongsang Province. Today, the abandoned mine is associated with one of the darkest civilian tragedies of the Korean War. But before people began telling ghost stories about the tunnels, before YouTubers and thrill seekers became fascinated by its reputation, this was a place where families lost fathers, brothers, sons, and husbands, and where many victims disappeared without even receiving a proper grave. The mine itself had existed long before the Korean War. During the Japanese colonial period, it was developed as an important mining site, and cobalt extracted from the area was valuable for wartime industries. When Japanese rule ended, the mine was abandoned, leaving behind a maze of horizontal tunnels and vertical shafts cut deep into the mountain. The tunnels were never designed to become a memorial, a cemetery, or a place of mourning. Yet in the summer of 1950, history transformed them into something far darker. The Korean War had begun, and fear spread rapidly across the country. In the chaos, civilians who had been classified as members of the National Bodo League, people considered politically suspicious, and prisoners from Daegu prison were taken away. Many were never seen alive again. According to South Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, mass killings took place around the Gyeongsan Cobalt Mine during July and August 1950. Victims had been brought from Gyeongsan, Cheongdo, Daegu, Yeongdong and surrounding areas. The commission determined that local police, intelligence personnel and military police were involved in the killings. It estimated that more than 1,800 people may have been killed, while bereaved families and civic groups have long placed the possible total much higher, at around 3,500. The exact number remains uncertain. That uncertainty is itself one of the most haunting parts of the story, because behind every missing number was a human being whose family waited for them to return. Imagine the summer of 1950. A truck arrives in a village. Families see prisoners or detainees being taken away. Some may believe they will eventually return. Others may already understand that something is terribly wrong. There are no ordinary goodbyes. No final letters. No graves. No certainty. The people disappear into the machinery of war and political violence, and the mountain waits silently beyond the village. According to testimony recorded by investigators, people were transported toward the mine and taken to the shafts in groups. Some witnesses described seeing trucks carrying detainees toward the area. The mine's vertical shafts became especially terrifying. Witness testimony recorded by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission described groups of people being taken toward a vertical shaft and shot. Their bodies were then left inside the mine. The abandoned tunnels, originally created to extract minerals from the earth, had been transformed into places where human lives were erased from the surface. The mountain became a hiding place for a crime that many people were afraid to talk about for decades. And perhaps that is where the ghost story truly begins, not with a mysterious apparition, but with silence. For years, the mine remained a place of painful memory. Families knew that their relatives had disappeared, but many had no idea exactly where their bodies were. During the authoritarian decades that followed the war, speaking openly about politically sensitive massacres could itself be dangerous. The families carried their grief quietly. Some waited for decades for answers. Others died without ever learning what had happened to the people they loved. Then investigators began returning to the mine. When excavation teams entered the abandoned tunnels, they found evidence that the darkness had preserved. Human remains were discovered among the underground passages. Bones, fragments and personal belongings began emerging from places that had been sealed away for decades. In 2008, one excavation reportedly recovered remains believed to represent around 200 people, one of the largest recoveries. Think about what that means. For more than half a century, someone could have walked across the mountain above those tunnels without knowing that beneath their feet were the remains of people whose families were still waiting for them. And then there were the personal belongings. A bone is evidence. A piece of clothing is evidence. A small object carried by someone on the final day of their life can be something more powerful. It reminds investigators that these were not numbers. They were people who had names, homes, families, habits and ordinary lives before the war interrupted everything. One of the most disturbing aspects of the mine is the way the underground environment seems to preserve the past. The tunnels are narrow and dark. The air is different from the world outside. Sound behaves strangely underground. A small movement can create an echo that seems to come from somewhere much farther away. Water dripping from the ceiling can sound like footsteps. Loose stones can move beneath someone's shoes. And when a person stands alone inside an abandoned tunnel, the mind naturally begins filling the darkness with possibilities. But the people who work to preserve the site have a very different relationship with that darkness. For them, these tunnels are not an attraction. They are graves. That distinction became increasingly important as stories about the mine spread online. Videos, photographs and discussions began portraying the site as a haunted location. Some visitors became interested in exploring it at night, searching for paranormal experiences. In recent years, so-called ghost tourism at massacre sites has become a growing concern in South Korea. At the Gyeongsan site, bereaved families and people involved in protecting the memorial have objected to visitors treating the location as an entertainment destination. Reports have described people entering the area with flashlights and visiting during the night, despite efforts to protect the site and preserve its dignity. And this creates an uncomfortable question. What if the most frightening thing about Gyeongsan Cobalt Mine isn't whether ghosts exist? What if the real horror is that people can stand above a mass grave and forget that it is a mass grave? There are stories told about abandoned places where visitors hear voices. At Gyeongsan, some may claim that they have heard whispers deep inside the tunnels. Others may describe footsteps following them through the darkness. Some might say they felt someone standing behind them even though nobody was there. But those experiences cannot be independently established as supernatural events. The mine itself provides countless ordinary explanations for strange sounds and sensations. Underground spaces amplify echoes. Wind can travel through openings. Water can fall from rock surfaces. Old structures shift. Darkness affects perception. Fear can make ordinary sounds seem extraordinary. Yet there is something that no scientific explanation can erase. The people who disappeared here really existed. The killings really happened. The remains really were found. And the families really did wait. That is why the mine's history can be more frightening than any invented ghost story. During earlier excavation efforts, investigators and researchers worked through the tunnels searching for remains. The scale of the tragedy made complete recovery extraordinarily difficult. A U.S. Institute of Peace report on South Korean transitional justice records that excavation at the Gyeongsan Cobalt Mines took place in 2007 and involved both horizontal and vertical shafts, with thousands believed to have been buried in the mine. Years passed. The mine did not surrender all of its secrets. In 2025, excavation work resumed after a long interruption, with renewed efforts to search for victims' remains. A report published in August 2025 noted that excavation had restarted after 16 years and again highlighted the enormous gap between the number of victims believed to have been killed and the number of remains recovered and identified. That means the story is not simply history. It is unfinished. Somewhere beneath the mountain, there may still be remains belonging to people whose families have spent generations waiting for answers. Imagine being a child in 1950 and watching your father leave. Imagine being told that he had been taken away. Imagine waiting that evening. Then another evening. Then another. Weeks become months. Months become years. You grow older. Your children grow older. Your father's name becomes something you whisper during family gatherings. And still, there is no grave. No confirmed remains. No place where you can kneel and say, "This is where you are." That is the true haunting of Gyeongsan. Not necessarily a pale figure appearing at the end of a tunnel. Not necessarily a voice calling someone's name. The haunting is the unanswered question. Where are they? Who were they? What happened during their final moments? And how many of them are still somewhere beneath the mountain? There is another disturbing thought. For decades, the mine was silent because people were afraid to speak. Today, it can become noisy for the opposite reason. Visitors arrive looking for frightening photographs. Explorers enter with cameras. People search for paranormal evidence. Someone hears a sound and calls it a ghost. Someone sees a shadow and calls it a spirit. But perhaps the dead do not need anyone to invent supernatural stories for them. Their real story is already terrifying enough. They were civilians and prisoners caught in the violence surrounding the Korean War. Many were killed without proper legal process, according to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings. Their bodies were placed in the mine, and their identities were lost or remained uncertain for decades. So if you ever see a video claiming that Gyeongsan Cobalt Mine is haunted, remember something before watching it as entertainment. The mountain does not need a ghost. It has history. The tunnel does not need a monster. It contains the remains of human beings. And the darkness does not need to whisper. The silence itself tells the story. Perhaps that is why the deepest fear comes when the flashlight begins to fade. You are standing inside an old tunnel. The entrance behind you is getting smaller. The walls disappear into blackness. Water falls somewhere in the distance. One drop. Then another. Then another. You hear something that sounds like footsteps. You stop. The sound stops. You take another step. There is another sound behind you. You turn around. Nothing. Only darkness. You raise the flashlight. The beam reaches several meters into the tunnel before disappearing. For a moment, you might imagine that someone is standing at the edge of the light. But then you remember what this place actually is. And suddenly, you no longer want to know whether the footsteps were supernatural. You simply want to leave. Because somewhere beneath Gyeongsan, the dead are still waiting to be remembered. Not as ghosts. Not as monsters. Not as content. But as people. People who had names. People who had families. People who once lived ordinary lives. And people whose final resting place became one of the darkest chapters of Korea's modern history. The Gyeongsan Cobalt Mine is therefore not merely a haunted location story. It is a historical crime scene, a burial site, and a place of continuing grief. Excavations have recovered human remains, but the full scale of the tragedy remains unresolved. So the next time someone asks, is Gyeongsan Cobalt Mine really haunted? Perhaps the most honest answer is this. We don't know whether spirits walk through those tunnels. But we know the dead are there. And we know they should never be forgotten. Because sometimes the most terrifying ghosts are not the ones that appear in the darkness. They are the memories that history tried to bury, and that refuse to disappear.